Hey there humans, Bob here and welcome to another Marvel Avengers video. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my Prime Thor build. Most builds out there focus on a single thing, but these Prime builds are made for you to be able to tackle pretty much anything the game can throw at you. Don't forget to like and subscribe as we roll that intro. So before we get into this, let's go over the sections that we're going to cover in this video. Number 1, stats, just how I've built my hero and why I focused on these stats. Number 2, skills, what skills I've selected and why. 3, champion points, what my focus around endgame leveling is. 4, gear, which perks I'm focusing on and why, and also where to farm this gear. And number 5, showcase, how this build actually works in combat. Right, let's start with which stats I focus on. My Thor, like the majority of my builds, is range focused, as being able to hit your enemies from a distance means you're less likely to be hit or staggered, stopping you from staying on the offensive. So, my choice stats for this build are firstly Valor. Valor on Thor is pretty interesting compared to most other heroes, as on most heroes Valor scales around a rate of 1 to 5, whereas on Thor it's more like 1 to 16. On top of this, as is with all heroes, Valor also scales crit damage at a rate of 2 to 1%, making it an incredibly valuable stat for pretty much every build. Whilst I'm aware others have been able to hit higher than the 20k I have in this build, I think it's still pretty healthy. Secondly, as mentioned before, I run a ranged Thor, so precision is a priority for me, and I'll show why later on in the video. Let's just say that Thor's muscles aren't just for show. I have this stat sit around 5k in my Prime build. Finally, the last stat I focused on, and honestly this is mainly just because most of the gear I focused on drops with it. It's resilience. This stat governs armor percentage, which is basically translated to how much less damage you take. On this build with a combo of comics, champion points and resilience, I've managed to stack a healthy 50%, which massively helps in activities like the raid, where Claw's minions have a tendency to target flyers like Thor. Let's move on to skills now. Obviously I have all of Thor's base skills unlocked, but let's go into the specifics, starting with the speciality tree. Under support heroic ability, I have Hell's Discretion. This allows me to revive my teammates when activating Warrior's Fury. Whilst typically not a support character, Thor is actually very good at being one, as his revive has one of the largest revive radiuses in the entire game, even bigger than Kamala's, which is really helpful in the raid and the OLT. Next, under support, I use Hell's Anger, which increases the crit chance by 10% and crit damage by 25% for anyone affected by the buff. This is incredibly helpful during DPS phases against bosses, both for you and your team. Now, onto the Assault Heroic specializations. First up, I use the Son of the Elder Gods to increase the damage that the Whirlwind applies, and also to add Cryo to enemies caught in the attack radius. This is especially useful when trying to take advantage of the battery effect, as it applies almost instantly. Onto the second now, I use the Rolling Thunder specialization. This skill refunds 5% of your heroic energy every time you take out an enemy, which basically means I can almost always have an Assault Heroic in my pocket, even if I just use one. Alternatively, if you just want pure damage, I can definitely recommend Overcharge Blast if you're used to keeping Warrior's Fury activated a lot. Finally, onto the ultimate specializations. For the first, I use Muspelheim's Torment. I use this as it applies plasma damage and status build-up in the activation area. This is incredibly handy as it is a positive status effect, and pretty much every other effect Thor does is a negative status effect, which means it's incredibly easy to apply this extra damage when using this specialization. And finally, as the last specialization I use, Odin's Blessing of the Realm, as upon activation of the Bifrost, I instantly get overcharged, which feeds into how I use the rest of my build. Now, let's look at the mastery skill tree. First off, combat. In the first slot, I use range damage to give myself a 15% damage boost. This works especially well for hammer throws and Odin Force attacks when I use the Power of Uru move. Second, although not really important to my build, as I'm largely focused on ranged attacks over melee, but I've opted for the combo damage for when I get up close and personal with Thor's signature attacks. And in the third slot, I've gone for the heroic takedown mastery, but honestly, it's so rare for me to do a takedown that it generally won't affect this build if you do have a different preference. Now onto probably the most important section of skills in my build, ranged. And to be honest, it's pretty much down to a single mastery selection, and that is critical throw. This mastery skill allows you to guarantee a critical attack with the hammer throw when you time it correctly. Not only that, but it also applies an extra 20% crit damage, but it doesn't even end there. Every follow-up attack from the Power of Uru move, which is Q on mouse and keyboard or right trigger on controller, is also guaranteed to be a critical attack, allowing you to not only ensure that you are hitting a ridiculous amount of crits, but also an increased damage rate. This works incredibly well with perks that proc on ranged critical attacks, as you're pretty much always doing them. Another final side effect of this skill is the fact that since you can guarantee a critical attack, you won't need to focus on proficiency as a stat with this build at all. In the second slot, high velocity is what I go with, as it makes it easier and quicker to continue hitting high damage hammer throws, but also create the critical throws that I occasionally miss time. Well, it happens, I'm only human. Finally, I use speed burst in the third slot, for pretty much no other reason that I'm lazy and I want to move faster through some missions. Onto the intrinsic ability tree now, and in the first slot I use Force of Will, as it allows me to regen health whilst dealing damage when Odin Force is active, which again feeds off the power of Uru attacks. The second slot further feeds that by using Maximum Force, which increases my available Odin Force energy by 15%. And lastly, Honed Force in slot 3 reduces the amount of intrinsic energy cost by 10%. Now with the last mastery tree, Intrinsic Overcharge, in the first slot I use Power Hazard, which creates electrical hazards when using melee power attacks, which is rare, but still a cool skill nonetheless. The second skill here though, which is Charged Heroic, is actually really helpful to this build, as it assists in regenerating heroic energy when Odin Force is overcharged. The especially interesting thing about this is, if you are already overcharged whilst picking up heroic orbs, this buff also applies there too, making them orbs themselves work harder for you. And for the last skill selection in this whole build, as this is primarily a damage focused build, I've opted for Damage Force, which boosts all damage whilst overcharged, for that little extra oomph against the toughest enemies in the game. Right, now we've gone over skill choices, let's talk about champion skill focuses. I tend to focus on similar skills with all heroes, with a little variance, but when the champion system first launched, we didn't really know what the best thing was to focus on. Naturally, I wanted to get more ranged and heroic damage with my Thor, but it turns out that the whole combat boost section basically adds nothing to your character. So with that in mind, here's my priority order for champion points. A quick note though, I wouldn't suggest going all the way to the 5th unlocks until you have spread points across the other skills, as 16 champion points aren't that easy to come across outside of, XP boost events. By the way, if you want to see the quickest way to level your champion points, don't forget to check out my fast XP leveling video, links in the description down below. Right, let's get onto the list. Number 1, critical damage. This is going to give you a 5% boost to crit damage, which this build heavily focuses on, so a major priority on this. Number 2, heroic recharge. With a 2.5% boost to recharge per unlock, this will help you to regain all your heroics incredibly quickly in general, but with this build, it'll help you to almost have infinite heroics. Number 3, perk chance. Basically, the more you unlock this tree, the more chance you'll have of proccing stuff like damage buff, payloads, and more, which help pretty much in every build. Number 4, stun and status damage. You'll gain an additional 2% on both of these damage types, which will help when dealing battery damage, but also stun, which really helps during certain raid phases. And finally, number 5, fortification boost. As I focus on resilience a lot with this build to lower any incoming damage, this is my main defensive focus, as all unlocks will provide a flat 5% additional armor. After these, feel free to put points wherever you like, but make sure you leave the combat ones until last, as they have the least utility across the board. Now, let's take a look at gear. One thing to bear in mind is that a lot of the gear featured here is from the regular and elite raid, so keep that in mind. That said, you will be able to use the basis of the build to achieve some of the same effects even if you haven't done the raid. So starting with melee, I'm using the elite version of the Discordant Van Braces, which has an amazing roll for this build, with resilience, precision, and valor all rolling above 90. The first perk is not something I rely on, but is super awesome when receiving the Sonic Conduit buff. I have a way of doing this later in the build, but will also work when any team member sends it, and will add an extra 15% status damage when active, which is basically any attack in this build. The second perk is great for me, as the only time I ever get close to an enemy with Thor, I focus on signature attacks, as they are so powerful. But also applying Sonic status is a great way to set up the battery effect and replenish heroic and intrinsic energy. And the third perk on this slot is all about boosting that Odin Force damage that this build focuses on so much, with a solid 18% buff. Thankfully, this piece is a targeted farmable piece, but only drops from the Elite Raid, which is arguably the toughest mission in the game right now. Now on to the second slot, again using a piece from the Elite Raid, I'm using the Discordant Binding Elite. This piece is my baby. I'm really happy with how the raid gear rolls, especially for Thor, as I don't need proficiency in this build. The high rolls for Valor, Resilience and Precision really feed into my damage output and absorption. The first perk here is pretty awesome, especially in large group of enemies. Basically, when attacking an enemy who has an active sonic status effect with vibranium damage, it will spread vibranium status to nearby enemies, which also primes enemies for battery damage from Odin Force attacks. I can fire off this using the second perk on this hammer, as pinned enemies and power attacks deal vibranium damage. And not only that, if I hit crits, which we've established I could pretty much guarantee on ranged power attacks, I also have a 36% chance of instantly applying a stack of vibranium status on the enemy. All of this feeds into my ability to double my damage with crit attacks and battery damage. Again, if you want to get this, you'll need to run the elite version of the Discordant Sound Raid. Moving on to the third slot now though, here I run another Discordant piece, the Battle Plate. Again, I've rolled this with 90 plus Valor, Precision and Resilience to really stack those stats up high. That said, this is probably the weakest gear piece in this build, mainly because the perks are very dependent on specific situations. For example, perk 1 I can use to apply Sonic Conduit to myself, but only works when reviving a teammate, which is highly situational. The second perk only works to apply Impact, which with a range build isn't as important compared to if I was running a melee build. And this also applies to the third perk, which reduces stagger. All that said though, this stat roll is the only thing keeping me from moving to another piece. I do have an alternate piece for this slot though, which is the elite version of this particular exotic, which is rolled without the resilience, but the perks are much more interesting from a damage perspective. Perk 1 helps to reduce incoming damage from vibranium attacks, with perk 2 increasing the damage to those affected with vibranium status. Finally, I have another Odin Force Breaker perk that increases any damage whilst Odin Force is active by another 18%. This is definitely the piece I choose to run when I don't need that extra resilience, so if you do come across it with the 3 stats, this is the piece I recommend more. As mentioned, you'll need to be running the regular or elite raid respectively for this gear. Now onto the 4th slot, arguably the glue of this build, as it allows for an extremely powerful cycle of heroics and Odin Force attacks. The Wreath of Yggdrasil drops with a cool roll of Resolve, Precision and Valor. It doesn't roll with Resilience, but considering where I have this stat in this build, I'm not really worried about stacking some into Resolve. But the key for this piece is the first perk, Odin Force Assistance. This heroic charge rate perk reads at a rate of 3.2% increase when Odin Force is active, but actually feels considerably higher. Much like the perk on my heroic slot in my Iron Man Prime build. Check out the link in the description down below for that, by the way. But yes, this perk is extremely powerful and always drops on this piece, so make it a priority for any Thor build and you'll pretty much be set to have rapidly recharging heroics with very little effort. On top of that though, I've managed to get it to roll with Assault Empowerment, which has a 50% chance of giving me an intrinsic burst when using the God Blast, which means I can use intrinsic energy to activate Odin Force to regain heroic energy quickly, then use the Assault Heroic to regain intrinsic energy quickly, creating a very effective loop if I'm ever caught with one of these energy meters depleted. Finally, I have probably one of the most reliable ways of proccing damage buff for Thor, as it uses the 16 attacks in rapid succession to proc it. For most characters, this isn't too easy, but using the hammer throw and then rapidly spamming the power of Uru attack, I can almost instantly proc it, with very little effort, which just furthers my damage output. This piece took me a while to get this perk roll on, so don't worry if you don't get it perfect first go. You're mainly looking for the first perk, which is guaranteed anyway. Good news on this piece though, you can farm it through villain sectors and even some threat sectors, if I remember correctly. So, happy hunting. Now onto artifacts. First off, I always make sure to have an ISO 8 of Cosmic Affinity. It's great for healing and is a staple for most builds in my opinion. I won't go into too much detail here on why I think that, but make sure to check out my other video on why I think it's actually the best perk in the game. I managed to secure an awesome roll here to match the raid gear with precision, resilience and valor, so I'm extremely happy with this despite taking a while to farm it. If you're looking for these, I recommend searching DNA chests in vault missions or doing the OLT. For the second minor artifact, I've managed to secure a perfect 3-stat valor roll on a yellow ISO, and managed to get it to roll with powerful breaker, which increases my power attack damage, which as we've established is a key attack in this build. Unfortunately, the other perk is almost always a bit lackluster, but the other perk very much makes up for it. There is another minor artifact that I've been chasing which has the pinpoint vibranium payload on it, like my hammer does, but for now, these certainly fit the bill. Finally, and this is more down to preference now, but for the major artifact, use either the Nornstone of Lethal Will, which will extend any damage buffs, plus add another damage buff when fighting tough enemies on activation, but I mainly use, during regular play at least, use the Tactagon to increase any status damage I output from my ranged attacks. And there you go, that's it for gear. So to summarize, in this build, we have guaranteed critical attacks, infinite heroic cycle, infinite intrinsic cycle, built-in battery attack, vibranium status leak, damage buff on tap, and even self-healing. Also, if you're looking for the best way to build your Iron Man, or you want to get raid ready so you can get some of these pieces that are featured in this build, check out these videos on the channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, stay safe, stay awesome, and I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.